How avoidants break down after losing a super empath. You ever meet someone who feels like home, someone who just gets you, even when you don't say a word? That's the super empath. They're the person who sees past the mask, hears what you don't say, and still stays. Not because they're blind to your flaws, but because they believe in the good in you, even when you don't believe in it yourself. But if you're avoidant, if you've been pushing away love the second it feels too close, you might not realize what you had until it's gone. You think you're protecting yourself from pain, but what you're really doing is rejecting the very thing that could heal you. Let me tell you what happens when a super empath finally walks away. At first, the avoidant feels relief, space, control. But that peace is short-lived. Because when the empath goes silent, when they stop checking in, stop trying, stop loving you despite it all, that silence gets loud. And suddenly, the avoidant is left with what they were trying to avoid all along themselves. You see, the super empath didn't just love them, they saw them. And losing that kind of mirror is devastating. The person who once offered compassion and emotional safety is gone. The avoidant loses the anchor they didn't even realize they had. And here's the kicker: the avoidant doesn't break down all at once. They unravel in stages. Denial, regret, obsessive reflection. They replay every moment, trying to figure out why they couldn't just let themselves be loved. And by the time they realize the depth of the loss, the empath has healed, they've transformed. So to the avoidant, I say this: if you've lost someone who loved you in your darkest moments, don't wait to break down. Wake up now. The next time love knocks, don't run. Stay, feel it, heal through it. Because some people won't come back once they've seen the cost of loving you. Super empaths have a rare ability to connect deeply with others on an emotional level. They are not just good listeners, they are emotionally intuitive, able to sense the shifts in energy, tone, and body language that reveal what someone is feeling even when no words are spoken. With avoidants, this trait becomes especially powerful because avoidants tend to hide behind emotional walls. They often struggle with vulnerability, finding safety in distance and control. But the super empath sees through that. They don't push aggressively, nor do they retreat in frustration. Instead, they gently hold space for the avoidant, allowing them to feel seen without pressure. This creates a dynamic that, at first, feels incredibly safe for the avoidant. For perhaps the first time in their life, someone is meeting them where they are without demanding immediate intimacy, but still offering warmth and presence. The super empath doesn't try to fix the avoidant, but they do extend understanding in a way that feels healing. They validate emotions that the avoidant may have long suppressed or never voiced. They recognize that the silence, the withdrawal, and the detachment are not rejection, they are fear. Fear of being overwhelmed, fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough. And rather than criticizing these patterns, the empath responds with patience, often to the point of exhaustion. What makes this bond unique is that super empath gives from a place of emotional abundance. They don't expect the avoidant to suddenly become open or emotionally fluent. They simply want authenticity, just a moment of honesty, just one truth behind the armor. This emotional generosity becomes the foundation of trust. The avoidant starts to feel accepted, not judged, and this is both comforting and terrifying, because with that trust comes a challenge to let someone in, and that's where the avoidant begins to struggle. The deeper the empath loves, the more intense the avoidant's need to retreat. But that only underscores how powerful the empath's presence truly is. To the avoidant, the super empath becomes more than a partner. They become a mirror, a reflection of the parts they've long buried. The gentle tone, the kind eyes, the steady presence, it all creates a safe, emotional space that the avoidant didn't know they needed. And while they might not admit it out loud, deep down they begin to feel something new, the desire to be fully seen, and yet still fully accepted. That experience is profound, and it only becomes clear how rare it was once it's gone. When a super empath finally walks away, the avoidant often feels an unexpected sense of relief. They've spent so long feeling suffocated by emotional intimacy, overwhelmed by the closeness that comes with being deeply seen, that the departure initially feels like freedom. They no longer have to manage the quiet guilt of being loved more than they can give. They no longer have to explain why they pull away, why they shut down, or why they seem distant even when things are going well. The pressure, both internal and external, lifts. And for a moment, they breathe easier. This phase is deceptive. The avoidant might tell themselves that leaving or losing the empath was necessary, even healthy. They might lean into logic, convincing themselves that the connection was too intense, too demanding, or too emotionally risky. They feel in control again. The absence of emotional confrontation gives them space to return to familiar patterns of independence and emotional detachment. They can resume their routines, focus on their work, or throw themselves into distractions without having to face vulnerability. It feels safe. But relief is not peace. What starts as freedom gradually becomes silence, and the silence becomes loud. Where there was once someone consistently checking in, someone who cared enough to ask how they were doing even when they gave nothing in return, there is now quiet. No more gentle reminders that they matter. No more emotional safety net. The subtle, constant presence that made them feel grounded, without them even realizing it, is gone. That's when the discomfort begins to creep in. It's not dramatic at first. It starts with wondering why the empath hasn't reached out, then checking their phone more than usual, then feeling irritated by the lack of contact, though they don't admit it. Slowly, the avoidant starts to feel the emotional vacuum left behind. Not because they suddenly want grand romantic gestures, but because they've lost something that offered them emotional stability without demanding more than they could give. The consistency, the care, the patience. It's missing now, and they start to notice. Eventually, the relief fades, and what replaces it is restlessness, a subtle ache they can't quite explain. They may not know how to label it as loneliness or regret, but they feel the shift. The absence of the empath's presence reveals how much of their emotional world was silently held together by that connection. And for someone who thought they didn't need anyone, this realization is deeply unsettling. The breakdown that happens after losing a super empath doesn't come in a dramatic wave. For the avoidant, it unfolds quietly, almost invisibly over time. They don't collapse emotionally the day the empath leaves. They often don't even acknowledge the loss right away. Instead, they go back to their default mode of self-protection, detachment, distraction, denial. They convince themselves that they're fine, that the space is good for them, that they never needed that depth of connection anyway. But under the surface, something begins to shift. Avoidants are masters of emotional suppression. They've trained themselves to disconnect from their feelings to avoid pain. So when the empath leaves, their first response is emotional numbness. They might even appear content or unaffected. They bury themselves in work, hobbies, surface-level interactions, anything that keeps them from having to sit with the void left behind. On the outside, it may look like they've moved on effortlessly, but on the inside, there's a quiet unraveling that starts the moment they realize the empath isn't coming back. This unraveling doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a crack in a dam. At first, they may catch themselves remembering random moments. How the empath used to smile and for no reason, how they could talk for hours and feel completely safe. Then come the dreams, the intrusive thoughts, the urge to check their social media or reach out. They might fight it, dismiss it, tell themselves it's just nostalgia. But the more they try to suppress these thoughts, the more persistent they become. What truly begins to break the avoidant down is the realization that the connection wasn't just deep. It was healing. The empath didn't just offer love, they offered emotional clarity. They made the avoidant feel understood in a way that bypassed words. And now, without that emotional mirror, the avoidant is forced to face themselves without guidance. That's where the true discomfort lies. Not in the loss itself, but in what the loss forces them to confront. They start to see the patterns, the emotional walls, the fear of vulnerability, the need for control. It all comes into focus, but instead of feeling empowered, they feel disoriented. They're left with the emotional mess they never wanted to face. And because they never truly learned to process feelings, the internal breakdown feels overwhelming. It's not loud. It's silent, private, and drawn out. But it's real. And it leaves them grappling with a truth they tried to avoiding, that pushing love away doesn't protect you. It isolates you. Regret for the avoidant doesn't hit like a lightning bolt. It creeps in gradually, often masked by pride, logic, or denial. At first, they may feel confident in their decision, or at least comfortable with the outcome. But over time, something shifts. They begin to notice the absence. Not just of the person, but of the feeling that person brought into their life, the emotional stability, the gentle presence, the sense that someone genuinely cared without condition. That kind of love doesn't just vanish from memory, even when you've convinced yourself you never needed it. As the days or weeks pass, they begin to replay old moments. The fights, the conversations, the quiet evenings that seemed uneventful at the time, but now feel meaningful. The empath's reactions stick with them. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were calm, kind, and emotionally grounded. The avoidant starts to question why they couldn't just respond with the same softness. Why every moment of closeness felt like a threat. Why they needed so much space when all the empath offered was love and acceptance. That's when regret really starts to set in. But it's not just about missing the other person. It's about realizing the loss was avoidable. It's about recognizing that they were given a rare kind of love and they didn't know how to receive it, that they were seen fully and accepted and they pushed it away. The avoidant mind begins to spiral in hindsight. They wonder if it could have been different. If maybe, just maybe, they were the problem, and for someone who spent a lifetime protecting their emotional core, that thought alone is terrifying. They might try to rationalize it away. They were too sensitive. We were too different. I wasn't ready. But these explanations begin to feel hollow. Because deep down, they know the empath didn't leave because they were weak or needy. They left because they were exhausted from loving someone who never let them in. And it's that realization that cuts the deepest. The loss wasn't due to a lack of love, but a lack of openness. This regret becomes a haunting companion. It doesn't scream, but it whispers at unexpected times. In quiet moments, during familiar routines, while watching a show they used to enjoy together. The avoidant may not admit it out loud, but internally they know they lost someone irreplaceable. And the hardest part is knowing they may not get another chance to do it differently. For the avoidant, healing doesn't begin with a new relationship, a fresh start, or a distraction. It begins the moment they finally take accountability for their own emotional patterns. Up until this point, they've likely blamed others, accused people of being too intense, too needy, or too emotional. It's been easier to focus on the flaws of their partners than to face the uncomfortable truth about themselves, that their fear of vulnerability has created a pattern of pushing away the very love they secretly crave. The end of a relationship with a super empath is often the moment that cracks this wall, because unlike others, the super empath didn't walk away because they were incapable of love. They walked away because they loved too much and received too little in return. That kind of exit stings in a different way. It forces the avoidant to reflect, not just on what they lost, but on how they contributed to the loss. This is the turning point. It's the space where real healing can finally start, if they're willing to be honest with themselves. Taking accountability means acknowledging the defense mechanisms they've built over time, the shutting down, the disappearing when things got too close, the reluctance to express real emotion. It's recognizing that love doesn't feel overwhelming because of the other person. It feels overwhelming because of old wounds that were never addressed. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being known and not being enough. All of it has led to self-sabotage disguised as self-protection. This process isn't easy. It requires sitting with discomfort instead of running from it. It demands emotional literacy, learning to name what they feel instead of numbing it. And perhaps hardest of all, it calls for humility, the willingness to admit that someone tried to love them in a way they couldn't receive, that they had a chance at something rare, and their inability to stay present cost them that connection. But in this accountability lies power, because if they can own their patterns, they can begin to shift them. They can start learning how to stay when it gets uncomfortable, how to communicate instead of retreat, and how to let themselves be seen without shutting down. The next time love shows up, they'll recognize it not as a threat, but as a chance to grow. Because healing isn't just about avoiding future heartbreak. It's about becoming someone who can finally hold space for love without fear of breaking under its weight. And so, if there's one truth that echoes through everything we've talked about today, it's this: you don't realize the depth of what you had until the silence replaces the warmth, until the reflection is gone, until the person who once held your heart with care walks away to protect their own. Avoidants don't break down loudly. They unravel quietly. But that unraveling is not the end. It can be the beginning of awareness, of healing, of transformation. Losing a super empath is painful, yes, but it's also a wake-up call, a mirror held up to the parts of ourselves we've avoided for too long. And while not every empath will return, the lessons they leave behind can lead you somewhere even more powerful, back to yourself, but finally ready to love fully. So, whether you're the one who walked away or the one left behind, remember this: real connection isn't about perfection. It's about presence and the courage to stay open even when it's hard. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for allowing space for truth. No matter how uncomfortable or raw it may feel, healing begins in moments like this. Take care of your heart, honor the ones who saw you deeply, and never forget sometimes the hardest loss is the one that teaches us how to finally show up for someone else and for ourselves. Thank you.